Uh, Ellora, who just told me how to pronounce her last name, but I'm not going to say it right. Derenoncourt, close?
Derenoncourt.
Derenoncourt. As our final speaker in our 2021 Demography Brown Bag series. Ellora is a first-year assistant professor here, just came to Berkeley to the Department of Economics after doing a postdoc at Princeton and her PhD at Harvard in economics. She's a labor economist and an economic historian, and she has appointments here in the Goldman School and in the economics department. And she uses quasi-experimental methods and original data to understand the evolution of racial equality in the US over the 20th century. Her recent studies have examined the Northern backlash against the Great Migration and the ensuing reductions in Black upward mobility. And then you may have also seen her name in the news a lot about her work on the role of federal minimum wage policy in accelerating racial earnings convergence during the civil rights era. We are just delighted that Ellora has come to Berkeley and delighted that she agreed to be a Pop Center affiliate and agreed to speak in our Brown Bag series her first year. We look forward to welcoming her in person next year, but in the meanwhile, we're going to get to see her on Zoom for the next 50 minutes or so. So I'll leave it to you, Ellora. Thanks for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that introduction. Wonderful to meet all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. So just a notice of change in programming content for anyone who didn't see that earlier. I'll be presenting my work on the Great Migration. Can you move to opportunity? Evidence from the Great Migration. And hopefully in a future year, as Sarah Merchant and I make progress, I can share with you work on the reverse Great Migration of Black Americans back to the South, but that is not ready yet, so. All right. Okay, so I usually like to begin this presentation by asking everyone in the audience to really try to put yourselves in the shoes of a typical Black family living in the US South in 1940. And if you were to ask that family, where would you go to provide the best opportunities for your kids? They would give you a quick answer: North, really anywhere but the South. Okay, and this map is one visualization of that intuition. It shows the fraction of Black teenagers growing up in sort of median educated households who managed to obtain more schooling than their parents. So what you can see here is in lighter shades of green, a smaller fraction of those teens, and in darker shades of green, a higher fraction, and in the gray areas where there's an insufficient number of Black Americans to get reliable statistics. But one thing pops out immediately, which is that the Southern United States is a region of low educational upward mobility, and the North and West of the country look much better. Now, if you were to pull out just one particular example, the city of Detroit in 1940 ranked among the top 5th of places in terms of educational upward mobility for Black families in this historical period. Now, if you fast forward to the present, the map of upward mobility for Black families in the US looks scrambled relative to the past. This is our best metric of localized upward mobility for Black Americans. What I'm showing you here is the average income rank as adults of Black men and women who grew up in median income households. And those statistics are shown here by their childhood commuting zone. Commuting zones are aggregations of US counties that reflect roughly metropolitan areas. And so we can specifically take, again, the case of Detroit, where you see that now Detroit ranks actually in the bottom 5th of places in the United States in terms of upward mobility for Black families. Now, what happened starting in 1940? Well, 1940 marks a pivotal moment in Black geographic mobility across the United States. It heralded the second wave of the Great Migration of Black Americans out of the South into cities in the North and West of the country. Some of the reasons for the acceleration of outmigration from the South during that time period include increased labor demand in war production and defense industries during World War II, and in the auto industries in the subsequent decades. And at the same time, you had important changes to the Southern economy, including mechanization in agriculture, where the majority of Black families worked in that time period, and combine that with ongoing political, social, and economic repression of Black families in the Jim Crow South. In other words, it didn't take much to kind of catalyze this mass emigration from the region. Now, what this movement out of the South entailed on the receiving end for destination locations in the North was a dramatic change in their racial composition, or I would go so far as to say even their racial identity. And this image that I'm showing you here is an image of a sign at a riot against an integrated federal housing project in Detroit that was being proposed in Detroit in 1942. And I show this sign just because it very succinctly captures the notion of restricted access to a local community and its benefits based on racial identity. So I was interested in exploring what the impact of this dramatic change in the racial composition of northern cities was for the trajectory of upward mobility for Black families in the region, given what I'm hinting at here, this kind of backlash response. So this is a condensed version of the talk. I'm going to jump right into giving you a bit of historical context for the Great Migration, and then into the data and the analysis and the results. Specifically, the question that I'm going to be asking is, how did the Great Migration plausibly alter the trajectory of upward mobility for Black families in the North, and through what mechanisms did it do so? So I'm not going to do justice to the very rich scholarship that's been done on the history of the Great Migration. I just want to give you kind of a taste for what it was like to face this decision as a Black migrant in the mid-20th century. And I'm drawing here from Isabel Wilkerson's fantastic book on the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns. And she includes in this book excerpts from interviews that were conducted of recent Black Southern migrants into Chicago in the period after World War I. And the question here was, why did you leave? Why did you undertake this tremendous journey? And among the responses, there's a recurring theme of leaving for better wages, better working conditions, a better life. I love that one person said, "My wife persuaded me." Well, they did the right thing, listening to their wife. If you were to look at the all right, well, that link doesn't work. If you were to look at the distribution of annual earnings for Black Americans across the United States at the time, I don't need a link to that map because it looks almost identical to the first map that I showed you. Earnings were much higher for Black Americans in the non-South compared to the South, and the scholarship shows that migrants could essentially double their earnings by moving north. Now, what consequence would this have for the children of great migrants? I want to just draw on the story of one particular individual, Helen Singleton, who is a civil rights activist based in Los Angeles. And when she gets asked in public speaking events, what drew you, what pushed you to join and be such an active member of the civil rights movement, she said, "My mother was my inspiration. She was one of those 6 million Black people who left the South so that her children wouldn't have to grow up and put up with what she had to grow up and put up with." And Helen Singleton went to high school in the North, and she remembers hearing about Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruling that desegregated Southern schools. And she remarks, "I was surprised to hear about it. I didn't go to school in the South. I didn't know that they didn't even go to school together down there. So this simple, kind of recollection highlights the very different set of aspirations that Black children growing up in the North would face compared to their counterparts in the South. And what's really striking is if you look today, the regional patterns in Black economic progress look very different. And to draw on a recent paper, there is no region in the United States where it is better to be poor and Black compared to being equally poor and white. Now, if you scrutinize that statement a little too closely, you realize in a tragic sense that has always been the case, but there was a reasonable aspiration to parity outside the South that is simply no longer the case today. And I'm going to explore the impact of this major demographic shock to the changes in the geography of upward mobility, the quote unquote promised land for Black Americans. Now, in order to do this, and it's great to be able to present this to the Pop Center here, what I'm going to do is leverage extremely rich historical US Census data and combine that with very new forms of data coming from US tax records to understand patterns of upward mobility in the past and in the present. So for the historical time period, I wanted to kind of paint a portrait or sketch out the map of what was the geography of upward mobility for Black Americans in the historical time period. And I'm going to draw on the complete count US Census for 1940. Now, the census, I don't need to explain this to this audience, is declassified after 72 years, giving researchers access to information on the universe of enumerated individuals, or for the 1940 period, roughly 132 million people. Also in the census, particularly the 1940 census, we have information on detailed educational outcomes for teenagers and parents while they're co-residing in the same household, enabling us to create measures of upward mobility that don't necessitate linking across historical censuses. Those linking methods are notoriously less able to create good links and match rates for Black Americans compared to white Americans. Some of that has to do with the legacy of slavery itself. A key input into linking methodologies is the use of first and last name, and Black Americans have fewer unique surnames, again, as a legacy of slavery. So it's really nice to be able to get around some of these issues using the 1940 census and to construct these measures of upward mobility within a single census decade. Additionally, you have detailed information on location, racial group, and other demographics available in the census. For the modern period, I'm going to draw on data sets of localized upward mobility that have been made available by Chetty, Hendren, Jones, and Porter, and Chetty and Hendren. These databases contain information on the income for parents and the adult income of kids of those parents from US federal tax records. And here in these data sources, parents and kids have been linked through dependent claiming on tax forms. And they provide upward mobility measures for the 1980s birth cohorts. Those are the most recent cohorts for whom we can reliably identify and examine a whole suite of adult outcomes. And then finally, these data sets have been linked internally to census to generate information on race, something that doesn't show up on your tax form. All right, so briefly, let me describe to you kind of the key outcomes that I'm going to be looking at in this study. I'm going to be focusing on upward mobility, by which broadly I mean the adult outcomes of kids conditional on parent economic status. So specifically here for the 1940s and this historical period, I'm going to focus on educational upward mobility, where I can observe teenagers who co-reside with parents and look at the outcomes of both. So specifically, the measure that I'm going to use in 1940 is that which I showed you on the first map. It's the fraction of teenagers in a commuting zone with 9 or more years of schooling, growing up in households where their parents had between 5 and 8 years of schooling. So I'm actually drawing on prior literature that has used these measures to construct upward mobility for the historical time period and kind of understand geographic patterns and differences by racial groups. I'm going to supplement this measure with measures of upward mobility from before 1940, with the constraint that before 1940, the census didn't ask detailed educational attainment questions, but instead what I'm going to use is a variable that was consistently included, which is the school attendance of teenagers. And I'm going to look specifically at the school attendance of teens from low socioeconomic status families. For the 2000s, the measure of upward mobility I'll be using is, again, what I showed you in the second map at the beginning of the talk, commuting zone level, estimated or average income rank of individuals, and at the household level for those growing up in different parts of the parent income distribution. So those growing up with low income parents, median income, and high income. Here, just a note, kids and parents are ranked nationally within the child's birth cohort. So these are not location-specific rankings, but where do you fall, having grown up in Detroit, where do you fall in the national income distribution? Now, admittedly, these are two distinct concepts of upward mobility: educational upward mobility for the historical time period that comes out of the data constraints of this period and my desire to include as many, essentially the universe of individuals, versus income upward mobility for the contemporary time period. I'm going to show that these are actually strongly correlated. So there's predictive content in the geography of educational upward mobility in 1940 for the income upward mobility measures today. So this is what I'm showing you here.
Ellora, just Ellora, one question just of the income. Could you just say again, how do you know the income of the child and the parent, and how are those linked? And what ages are they?
Yep. So these data on kind of income upward mobility statistics are derived from tax records dating back to the 1990s. And after identifying the parents by dependent claiming, so looking at individuals who were born in the 1980s, who claimed them as dependents in these earlier tax records, we can observe parent income. And then we follow those individuals in the more recent years to look at their income when they're in their 30s or in their late 20s.
Perfect, thanks.
All right, so this is just to show you that indeed there is predictive content and information in historical geographies of upward mobility for the present. On the x-axis here, shown at the commuting zone level and then binned for every 5 percentiles here, I'm showing you the group of commuting zones that fall in different percentile bins of the outcome variable here. So the x-axis is showing you the fraction of teens who obtain more education than their parents in 1940 at the commuting zone level. The y-axis is average income rank of individuals from lower socioeconomic status families today. And so you can see this relationship and a correlation coefficient of 0.5 between historical upward mobility and contemporary upward mobility.
Can you comment on the nonlinearity there? The fact that it falls at about 45 on the x-axis?
That's a really interesting point. Usually when I look at this picture, it's reassuringly linear compared to other kind of bin scatter plots, but it's true there does seem to be somewhat of a pattern, which might indicate just where the historical measure seems to fit better than the contemporary measure. So out here at this upper end, there seems to be less of a relationship, but I wouldn't read too much into the fluctuations across different points in this distribution. But that is something that could be interesting to explore with, for example, even finer grained geographies where you have more observations.
Thank you.
So let me tell you about the sample of commuting zones that I'm going to be analyzing for this study. I'm going to be focusing on urban, non-Southern, continental United States commuting zones. And as a shorthand, I'm going to often refer to that as the North in this presentation, but just letting you know that North here really means non-South. There were two criteria for entering my sample. One, I had to be able to observe demographic changes during the peak of the Great Migration, which is the period of focus in my study for the cities in these commuting zones. And I'm going to draw that information from the city data books covering 1944 to 1977, which include demographic information for cities with a population of 25,000 or more in the survey year. I'm going to end up with close to 300 cities where I observe the change in the Black population between 1940 and 1970. Now, these are the major cities, so I'm going to capture most of the population. That's something I'll talk about in a second. The second criterion is that the commuting zone be in a state that on net received Black migrants during the Great Migration. So this comes back to this definition of the non-South or the North. That's going to include the census divisions in the Northeast, Midwest, and West, plus 3 locations that are technically in the South, but on net received Black migrants. And those include Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. So in the end, I'm going to have 130 commuting zones that I'm going to follow over time. That may not sound like very many, but the coverage of the population is very good. So 85% of the non-Southern US population lives in one of these commuting zones, 97% of the non-Southern Black population. And then correspondingly for the US overall, about 60% of the whole US population and 50% of the Black population. The key measure of Black population change that I'm going to be focusing on is the increase in the urban Black population in the commuting zone from 1940 to 1970, normalized by the total urban population in that commuting zone in 1940. So I'm going to normalize by the base year urban population as opposed to the 1970 urban population, which you might think could be itself affected by the outcome through, for example, the phenomenon of white flight. And the key regressor that I'm going to be looking at in this study is the distribution of this variable. So let me explain that in one slide. I'm going to be focusing on the impact of the percentile change in the urban Black population. And let me show you why in a couple of slides. So first, this is sort of the distribution of Great Migration era increases in the Black population from 1940 to 1970 across the commuting zones in my sample. You can think of this as a rotated cumulative distribution function where the x-axis is the percentile of the increase and the y-axis is this measure that I just defined for you, the change in the urban Black population from 1940 to 1970 normalized by the base period population. Here, oops, sorry, I've multiplied by 100, so you can think of this as percentage point changes in the Black population share. So one thing you can read off of this graph is that the median commuting zone at the 50th percentile here saw a change in its urban Black population share of about 5.5 percentage points. But this is going to mask a large degree of heterogeneity across these northern commuting zones, with places like Salt Lake City seeing barely any change in their Black population share, and at the upper end, places like Detroit, Gary, Indiana, or Washington, D.C., seeing increases in their Black population share of between 30 and 50 percentage points. Now, when I look just in the raw data at the relationship between the percentile of Black population change during the Great Migration, same x-axis here, and upward mobility in destination commuting zones today, I see a strikingly negative and also linear relationship. What does that mean? That means that for places that saw very little change in their Black population share in levels, going from one to a place with a slightly higher change, is associated with the same reduction in upward mobility as places at the tail end here that started with higher Black population shares and experienced larger increases in the Black population share. So again, you can picture kind of Detroit, Gary, and Washington, D.C. on this end of the figure. What that suggests is a nonlinearity in the level changes of the Black population share that actually kind of accords or has resonances with the literature on tipping points, and the fact that because I'm studying commuting zones, if one specific neighborhood sees an inflow of Black migrants that generates white flight, this is going to have kind of spillover effects to the larger commuting zone. So because Black populations in northern metropolitan areas were already quite concentrated, even a small level of in-migration can sort of push the population to spill over into neighboring communities in that commuting zone. So I'm going to be focusing on the percentile of Black population change as the regressor of interest, given this nonlinear relationship in levels.
Can you just say a word about what places we should have in mind at the left end? Is it places like Salt Lake City or?
So you can think of places like Salt Lake City, sort of the median here would be a place like Pittsburgh or Buffalo, New York, and then we get to Chicago or Detroit on this end here. So what's nice about that is there is, and I'll talk about this actually in the next slide, is that there is variation across, for example, places that share certain kinds of characteristics. So you can think of manufacturing centers in the intensity of the Great Migration into those kinds of locations. So the reason that I want to talk about that next is because if you look at, I could stop the talk here, I'm pretty good on time, it's 12:37, and say, well, there's a really striking relationship here. But there are many reasons that we wouldn't want to interpret that relationship as causal. And that has to do with, what are the characteristics of places that saw these major changes in their Black population during this 30-year period. So when I look at the characteristics of these locations in the baseline period, 1940, what do I see? What places experienced big increases in their Black population? The first correlate that I want to mention here is educational upward mobility in 1940. It turns out that the Black population in the North increased more in places that were high upward mobility in 1940. So you can imagine, if migrants, and we don't think they did, but if they had a map of where are the best places, they went to those places. The second is that indeed, of course, we know that manufacturing jobs were drawing migrants to the North. There is a correlation between where people went and the share of manufacturing jobs in that location. The correlation is maybe not as big as you might expect, about 0.2. And then finally, the biggest determinant here is, was there an existing community of Black Southerners? And that is kind of one of the most important predictors of where Black migrants went in the intervening or in the subsequent decades. And so that's something that I'm going to want to control for and leverage instead kind of idiosyncrasies that were in changes in the Southern economy to generate variation in the intensity of the migration in the North. So the punchline here is that, of course, places aren't being randomly assigned as Great Migration destinations, and there are important correlates, characteristics of locations in 1940 that are correlated with Black in-migration. Now, given that and other potential omitted characteristics that might both drive Black migration and changes in upward mobility, I'm going to implement an instrumental variable strategy to understand the causal effect of the Great Migration as this demographic shock and racial composition shock on upward mobility for Black Americans in subsequent decades. So I'm going to explain this instrument in just a couple of pictures. And the idea here is, okay, places aren't randomly being assigned as destinations in the North, but there is a kind of quasi-experimental source of variation that we can make use of and that other scholars have made use of in the literature studying the Great Migration. And that is the fact that within comparable locations in terms of being a great migration destination, take, for example, Detroit and Baltimore, both at the upper end of receiving Black migrants. Migrants into those locations came from different places in the South. So here it is for Detroit and Baltimore. The plurality of Black Southern migrants into Detroit came from Alabama. The plurality of Black Southern migrants into Baltimore came from Virginia. Those two locations in the South experienced very different patterns in total outmigration over the period of the Great Migration. So here you can see the number of net migrants in thousands, where negative numbers indicate outmigration from those regions. The lines here represent southern states, and I'm highlighting those two states that I just mentioned, Alabama and Virginia. Alabama was a cotton planting state. Cotton was mechanizing over this time period. That induced job loss in the agricultural sector. And that lowered the opportunity cost of migrating for Black farm workers who were concentrated in those sectors. Virginia, by contrast, was a major recipient of war contracts during World War II, resulting in less outmigration from that region. So you can actually leverage that variation in Southern economic characteristics to predict outmigration from different origin locations. So here is just using economic characteristics of those locations to predict net migration. And you can see I recover variation in migration that way. The idea is going to be to, before I get into more complicated figures, the idea is going to be to interact those two sources of variation. So leverage the kind of idiosyncratic nature of where people migrate, which places people migrated from, and shocks to their origin locations to generate plausibly, quasi-random variation in the intensity of the Great Migration in the North. And actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but I welcome detailed discussion of that after the presentation. All right, so the essence here is to combine the variation in where people came from with changes in the economy in the origin locations that we think is not influenced by what's going on in the North. And that's the key thing here. We don't want to be picking up confounding explanations like deindustrialization or what's going on in terms of school quality across northern locations. These sources of potential bias in estimating the impact of the migration on upward mobility. All right, to come back to the key question here, did the Great Migration, or really what I prefer to say is the reactions to the Great Migration, ultimately reduce upward mobility in the North? And this is an important question here, because if so, there is a kind of tragic irony in this. The Great Migration, I would argue, represents the largest natural experiment in moving to opportunity in US history. So we deserve to know, what happened as a result of this mass migration event. All right, so here I'm showing you now the impact of that instrument for Great Migration. So when I predict the Black population change in the North using idiosyncrasies of Southern migration patterns and what's going on in the South alone, what is the impact on upward mobility in those destination locations today? So as you can see, I again recover this striking negative relationship between the now predicted change in the Black population from Southern migration patterns and upward mobility in the Northern locations today. Now, to put a number on this, what I'm finding is that a 1 standard deviation increase in the Great Migration, you can think of that as moving from Pittsburgh's treatment to Baltimore's, for example. 1 standard deviation increase is about a 30 percentile change. Lowered average income rank of individuals from low-income families, so growing up in these locations today, results in an 11% drop in adult income. So that is kind of the quantifying the effect size. But that immediately raises a question. A migration event can do two things. It does change the composition of families living in a location. And it can also induce a reaction in the location itself. Both of these might impact children's outcomes later on. So for example, if the Great Migration were a migratory event that changed the composition of families in the North, such that there were, say, a greater share of families that weren't able to produce good outcomes for their kids. So imagine that one of the key things that is going to lead to a child having good outcomes coming from certain types of families is investment in education. Suppose that lower education quality in the South was kind of being imported through these families migrating north, and that's an explanation for why their kids have lower outcomes as adults later on. That would be this kind of composition channel or selection channel for why the Great Migration is associated with less upward mobility today. But the other channel is that the reaction of locations to Black migrants coming in, and when I say locations, I mean local residents, local policymakers, changes in local institutions, can also influence kids' outcomes in a location. So some of the mechanisms that I'm going to talk about later on: white flight, segregation, investments in punitive policies in the destination locations, that can also affect kids' outcomes later in life and might also be behind the associated reductions in upward mobility that I just showed you. All right, can I just do a time check?
So I think we should probably jump to your discussion of the white flight and things like that, because we
Okay,
probably
great.
can finish in about 5 minutes.
That sounds perfect.
Any question? Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to skip ahead here and just say, let me pause on this slide for a second. So I skipped 2 slides that illustrate the way that I decompose the impact of the Great Migration on upward mobility through these 2 channels. And the solution was to rely on a data set of outcomes today that reflects the causal effect of locations on kids' outcomes. So any one of you or I today could go to this website, the Opportunity Insights website, and download information on upward mobility in 2 forms. One that reflects, here are the average outcomes of people born in the 1980s in these locations based on where they grew up. The other reflects the impact of a location on your adult outcomes through differential childhood exposure. So you can imagine 2 families moving from, no, I won't, it's too much on that slide, moving from the same origin location to different destination cities, but in one family, the kids are younger, and in another family, the kids are older. So the idea here is that moving to Pittsburgh as a 10-year-old versus an 11-year-old, the younger child is going to have more exposure to Pittsburgh. By the same token, imagine families moving to Baltimore with the same differential. Now, the argument here that I'm making is that the additional year of childhood exposure to a major Great Migration city is going to result in reduced adult income compared to an additional year of exposure in a city that was less affected by the Great Migration. That's the picture that I'm showing you here. I can put a number on what the impact of 1 additional year of exposure to a Great Migration destination city is on your adult income, and that's reflected here. What I'm going to do is scale that so that it's comparable to the other estimate. And now I have an estimate that reflects, okay, here is the reduction in upward mobility from the Great Migration, could be selection, could be the change in locations, and here is an estimate that really isolates the impact of the location. And what I find when I put those in comparable scale is that the location channel explains all of the reduction in upward mobility. You could phrase this as, if I were to drop an arbitrary child in a Great Migration city, something that, no RCT, you're never going to get IRB approval for that. Here is the quasi-experimental version. That's going to result in a reduction of adult income of 10%. That overall effect was 11%. You can see that location is the driving mechanism here. All right, and now we want to talk about what happened. So I'm skipping the piece of the paper that looks at heterogeneity of the impact of the Great Migration on outcomes, but the punchline is that the group that's most affected is Black men in particular. So Black men growing up in Pittsburgh compared to Black men growing up in Detroit, coming from the same parent income, those growing up in Detroit are going to be negatively affected in terms of their adult outcomes. This is not true of any other demographic group. And the reasons for that are going to be clear when I talk about how the urban environment changed in response to the Great Migration. In one slide, two key mechanisms. One is white flight. Incumbent white families in the destination locations withdrew not just from shared urban neighborhoods, something that's been documented in prior literature, but also shared school systems. So I see a separation of Black families concentrated in the public school system, an increase in white families in the private school system, highlighting another dimension through which this tracking and separation occurs. Second, changes in the quality of the urban environment. That's the second key mechanism here. I note that economic opportunity seems more sprawled as measured by commute times, but also a very salient measure of the quality of urban environments is the urban murder rate, which I observe is higher in Great Migration locations. The public policy response to urban decline in Great Migration locations was investment in punitive policy. Great Migration locations increased investment in policing. They have higher incarceration rates. There's no differential investment in these other public policies. I then show, and please check out the paper for 100 years of data on these outcomes. The change in policy occurs during the Great Migration, but persists several decades after, both in terms of the policing effects and the incarceration effects. Now, I just want to conclude here, skipping a lot of slides, so please do check out the paper. That what I've documented is that the promised land of the North, these high opportunity areas historically for Black families became quote unquote opportunity deserts. And the reason for this is that the backlash to the Great Migration really took the ladder of opportunity away from Black families that had undertaken this journey, such that generations later, there's no differential for Black families in terms of raising your kids in the North compared to the South. And that's actually really quite shocking. And the reason for this is specifically the white flight and kind of public policy responses to the Great Migration. And here we are kind of 50 years of policing, incarceration, and persistent crime later, and the question that I want to leave you with is, do we need a different set of policies to address racial inequality in American cities? Thanks very much.
Terrific, Ellora. Thank you so much, and thanks for adapting to our time there at the end by cutting to the end. We do have plenty of time for some questions. Let me just start with calling on Christine. Is that okay, Christine?
Sure. I just had a question of clarification. These are average income. These are lower average income ranks of all individuals from low-income families or of Black individuals? And do we know what the impact was on the non-Black individuals in these cities with high in-migration or higher in-migration?
Excellent question. So here is the slide. So
awesome.
Initially I showed you results for all individuals, and then I asked the question, who, if I go by demographic group, is affected? And that's where you can see that the largest effects are for Black men. But in particular, your parent income doesn't shield you. Black men who grew up in high income families have lower adult income if they grew up in Great Migration cities compared to those who did not. But the effects are muted for all the other groups. And what's maybe most interesting is that they're quite muted for Black women as well. And I discuss the relationship to the literature that shows that boys' outcomes are more sensitive to family and environmental factors.
And so this would suggest that you should have, if you could have seen into the future, you would have made different decisions if you had daughters versus sons, maybe, about where to move or something.
I think of this paper and this is something I also skipped, not so much as the question, the counterfactual, should Black people have moved to the North? And I do try to speak to that in the paper. The question asked here is, how did places in the North look if they received a large inflow versus a small inflow? So it's really about the reaction to the Great Migration. When we think about that bigger counterfactual, should Black people have moved, I actually come down on the side of, after some like back of the envelope calculations, absolutely. Why? Because the Great Migration moved Black grandparents way up in the national income distribution. And it's kind of disturbing, but the reality is the higher income your parents are, the better your outcomes are as an adult. So that's the kind of countervailing force that means that on net, we think the Great Migration was still an important one for Black economic progress.
Okay. Ellora, could you say a word about people who stay, say, in Detroit? So maybe Black parents with sons who stay in Detroit versus those who would move out, exactly because they see these kind of issues, and how that affects your analysis? Or what we're seeing the effect of people who choose to stay in the place, or is it rather that's already taken care of, the kind of second level of migration?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, what you're seeing here is the people who, in these outcomes, people who are there, who stayed there, kids, or their adult outcomes based on the places that they grew up in. Now, what I showed before, that the Great Migration influences your adult outcome through exposure, those results really suggest that it's the location, not so much selection driving this. So selection in terms of who came in, but also who differentially exits, right? So it's true that these results don't take into account that selection piece, but they line up very well with the results on childhood exposure, suggesting that really it's the location driving this as opposed to differential exit from these locations. Now, this kind of relates to my next phase of work on the reverse migration, because what we do see, I like to highlight, historically, Black people in the United States have always acted very rationally. So once urban decline really takes off, you see a change in the direction of net migration of Black Americans back to the South. And I suspect that this sharp decline in the quality of urban environments has something to do with it. This is a little bit after the cohorts that I'm looking at now that this reverse migration really takes off. So I'm not so concerned that that differential migration is affecting these families.
What kind of pushback do you get on your interpretation? Do you get the pushback, say, that no, what's happening here is that when you have a certain fraction of the city being composed of young Black men, that it changes the dynamics of the city? I mean, that's I guess if I were a kind of a cultural if I had the idea of Black male culture in these cities, that's what I might think.
I mean, I think you should be really thinking about children. And, based on the environment that you were exposed to as a 9-year-old versus a 10-year-old, what are the impacts that show up later on your income? So I really like to focus on that, because, nobody is choosing to be exposed to, dilapidated urban environments, to higher crime. Of course, we know of evidence of the impacts of exposure to crime and violence on adult outcomes, but nobody is choosing that in this situation. And that's part of the power, I think, of focusing on your childhood location and how characteristics of your childhood location influence your outcomes later in life. So really the question that I hope to kind of push people towards is, when we think about policies to improve intergenerational mobility, we think about incentivizing people to move their families to higher opportunity locations. That's a very popular policy today. It's called Creating Moves to Opportunity. This is a long history MTO. And what I really want to point out here is, you're only going to ever affect a tiny fraction of the population with housing vouchers. The other piece that we need to think about is the causal effect that specific policy choices have in a place on long run outcomes. And what I hope that this paper can get us to think about is the components, the recipes of high opportunity, of good opportunity in locations. And those should be levers of policy.
Great, we're at 1 o'clock. We have time for a last question. If somebody wants to just unmute, they can, or just type your name in chat and I'll call on you.
Hi, this is Will. I'm curious. I don't know the related literature on migration from prior waves of migration into the U.S. But if you look at the prior European waves of migration, I saw in the paper you show that those don't seem to explain your results. But if you were to look at upward mobility in those cities that received more migrants in those prior periods, are there strong studies which suggest that you see similar results, that big waves of migration can lead to lower upward mobility? Or do you find that those prior waves of migration are actually increasing upward mobility and there's something very specific to the Black migration which is leading to these adverse responses?
This is an excellent question. So you're right. I look at the historical European migration into the United States during the age of mass migration, and whether that's kind of a confounding factor explaining the results, and it's not. And then the question is, is this migration somehow different? So there is a study that looks at the long run effects of European mass migration on outcomes today, including income, for example, and other measures, and finds very beneficial effects of that age of mass migration. I don't know of studies that specifically looked at upward mobility, so that's something to look at. What I did look at is that, over this time period, you had the Great Black Migration, but you also had a large degree of white Southern out-migration into the North. And I create an instrument of white Southern migration into locations and look at the impact of these location effects, or, the gains from growing up in specific destination locations, and I find no relationship. Interestingly, when I put on the left-hand side these outcomes here, which can contain a selection component, I see a negative effect on white individuals' outcomes, which suggests there is kind of a change in the composition of families in places that receive large waves of white Southern migration.
Great. Well, thank you so much. If people could turn off their mute and let Ellora hear your hands clapping together. Thank you so much. And congratulations on almost making it through your first year, Ellora. The semester is about to end. We're all kind of counting the days. And I don't know if you participated in PAA, but PAA will be online this year. So if you don't normally, that's our annual demography meeting. And there's a lot of complete census panels if you're interested in economic history.